Alright, we're going to start with preparing our sewing machine. I am using this Magnolia machine by Janome. This is intended for my students at Klein Cain High School, so I'm using the machine that they are using. I'm focusing right now on this digital printout. Right now, this light here at the top is telling me that the machine is set to sew stitch number 1. That is a straight stitch with the needle in the middle of the opening of the presser foot. When I scroll down, now it's telling me what my zigzag width is going to be, and I can adjust the needle position on this version of this machine by playing with this button. Now it's telling me my stitch length is 2.2. For new sewers, a 2.2 stitch length is probably too small, so I always encourage my newer sewers to crank their stitch length up to at least a 2.8 or a 3. I'm going to come back here and I'm going to focus the camera now on the needle, and I'm going to scroll back to my zigzag, and I'm going to change the needle position by pushing the plus or minus button. So you can see that when I push this button, the needle is moving to the right and it is moving to the left. So this is what I'm talking about by moving the needle. I'm going to move the needle back to the center position. Here on the throat plate of the machine, we have some markings that are telling us that when we put the edge of the fabric along these lines, we will be sewing a measured seam allowance. Everything that you sew is the sum of its parts. So if you sew with an inaccurate seam allowance or with a seam allowance that's not measured correctly, your garment or your project is going to be the wrong size. So I'm going to be sewing pardon me, my seam allowances with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, which is the standard width of seam allowance on most commercial patterns. We're also going to practice sewing some stitch lengths. So just for the stitch length project, I'm going to start just before the end of the fabric, and I'm going to reinforce this stitch with a back stitch. So I'm going to start with back stitch first, and I'm going to sew to the end of the fabric, and then I'm going to come forward. So I'm practicing some back stitching, and I'm sewing a regular stitch length. Okay, so I've done a bit of this. I'm going to stop. Now I'm going to change my stitch length to a smaller stitch length, like a 1.5. And I'm going to get a much smaller stitch length. This stitch length is nice for stay stitching. It's still big enough that I can take it out if I need to, but it's small enough to hold the garment in position. Now I'm going to change my stitch length to a really long stitch, as long as it will go. And I'm going to have a long stitch or an easing stitch or a gathering stitch. And when I get to the end, I'm going to back stitch about 3 or 4 stitches on the fabric, and I'm going to stop. And then I can pull the fabric out to the end of the sewing machine and I can clip off my fabric. So now I have regular stitching, stay stitching, and gathering.